Hey guys, so it is starting to get good. We kind of left at like a cliffhanger last time, so I'm going to pick up right where we left off. Um, let's see. She stood there smiling. In her hand was an ivory handled cane. Well, young man, what is it? What makes you think you can roam around other people's houses at night? What do you want? Lewis was afraid he might faint, but he didn't. Instead, he felt himself stiffen. He raised his cane. I don't know what you want to do to us, Mrs. Izzard, he said, but you're not going to do it. My uncle's magic is stronger than yours. She laughed a harsh, nasty laugh. Do you mean that toy cane? He probably got it at the county fair. Don't be foolish, child. Although the house, all through the house, the cane had burned with a steady gray light. Now, as Mrs. Izzard spoke, the glow began to go dark. Lewis looked down and saw that he was staring at something that looked very much like a burned out light bulb. And now, said Mrs. Izzard, stepping forward, and now, my fine young friend, you will see what it is to bother nice old ladies who just want to be left alone. She snatched the cane from his numb hand and threw it clattering down the stairs. Now she was bending over him, and the light reflected from her spectacles hurt his eyes. Her voice was angry now, and she talked faster. Do you have any idea what it's like to be buried deep into the earth, dark stones all around, no one to hear you or see you, only the company of a dead man? Do you? Stop right there, Mrs. Izzard. You're not dealing with children now. There at the bottom of the stairs stood Mrs. Zimmerman. Her face was lit by invisible footlights, and she wore a floor-length purple cape. In the folds inside the shadows were deep wells of orange fire. In one hand she held a tall black pole with a clear glass globe on top of it. Inside the globe a magenta star burned. It grew in brightness when she spoke and dwindled when she was silent. Mrs. Izzard turned around. She faced Mrs. Zimmerman calmly. So it's you, she said. Well, my power has not reached its height, but I'm still strong enough to deal with you, aren't you? She pointed the ivory cane at Mrs. Zimmerman. Nothing happened. She stopped smiling and dropped her cane. Now it was Mrs. Zimmerman's turn. She pounded the butt of her staff once on the floor, and the staircase was lit with a flash of ultraviolet lightning. With an awful scraping cry that no human has ever made, Mrs. Izzard rushed past Lewis up the stairs, and Mrs. Zimmerman started up after her. Run back home, Lewis, she shouted as she dashed past him. You're a brave boy, but you're no match for that thing. Run, I tell you. And there's the picture that it shows. Lewis bounded down the stairs, taking them two at a time. He was terrified, but he was very happy too. As he ran down the front steps of the house, he heard strange exploding sounds and sharp cries. Branches grabbed at him as he ran along the well-swept brick wall. One of them actually wrapped itself around his leg and started to pull. With a scream and a frantic thrashing motion, Lewis tore loose and plunged across the street. He threw open the gate and ran, whoomp, into something hard and yet soft, Jonathan. Lewis broke down. He began to weep hysterically with his face pressed into Jonathan's blue work shirt. Jonathan wrapped his arms around Lewis and he held them tight. Though Lewis could not see it, Jonathan was staring over his head at the Hanchett house, where there was a grim smile on his face. A purple flash lit up the upstairs window. Now a cold blue-white pinpoint was kindled in the adjoining window, as if someone had just lit a strange kind of match. The blue light spread till it filled the window. It spread to the other window and ate up the fading purple light. Now there was a dull, powerful explosion like an aerial bomb at a fireworks display. It hurt Jonathan's ears as he watched both upstairs windows turn a brilliant purple. The chimney of the house toppled and the bricks slid down the roof. The overgrown hedge thrashed and swayed as if it had been caught in a hurricane. Several diamond-shaped pieces of glass fell out of their frames and tinkled on the wall below, and the house was silent and dark. Lewis had stopped crying now, and he turned around to look. A full minute had passed. The front door scraped open, and Mrs. Zimmerman appeared. She walked calmly down the steps and down the brick wall and out into the street, humming as she went. The orange fires in the creases of her robe had gone out, and so had the magic footlights. In one hand she held an old umbrella. The handle of the umbrella was the crystal knob. A tiny seed of violet fire still burned in it. In her other hand, Mrs. Zimmerman held Jonathan's cane. Its globe was still dark. Hi, Florence, said Jonathan, as if he were meeting her on the street on a Sunday afternoon. How'd it go? Well enough, she said, handing him his cane. Here's your magic wand. It's took quite a shock, but I think it'll recover. As for Mrs. Izzard, I don't I just don't know. I may have destroyed her, or I may have just put her out of action for a while. In any case, let's take time that has been given to us and find that clock. Chapter 10. When the three of them got back to the house, they had a shock. The ticking was very loud now, louder than it had ever been. It was like standing inside the works of Big Ben. Jonathan turned pale. It looks, he said, as if things are drawn to some conclusions. Mrs. Izzard may not be as dead as we could wish. Mrs. Zimmerman began to pace back and forth. She rubbed the purple stone of her ring against her chin. She may be or she may not be. Either way, having her out of the way is no guarantee that the bomb won't blow up in our faces, she said. But let's assume the worst. Let's assume that she's still in the game. All right. She took a deep breath and let it out. It's been my theory ever since yesterday that the old hag is just waiting for the proper time to use that wretched key. The proper action at the proper time to achieve the proper effect. That would be like her, and like her old husband too. His magic is logical. It proceeds from A to B to C in 9 neat steps, as logical and neat as the movement of a hand around the face of a clock. Then there's no point in our being logical, is there, said Jonathan? He was smiling very strangely and clicking the paper clips on his watch chain. This was always a sign that he was thinking. What do you mean, said Louis and Mrs. Zimmerman at the same time. I mean, he said patiently, that we're no good at this sort of game. Our game is wild swoops, suddenly inexplicable discoveries, cloudy thinking, knights jumping instead of files of rocks plowing across the board. So we'd better play out our way if we expect to win. Mrs. Zimmerman folded her arms and looked grumpy. I see, she said. It sounded very reasonable. If you're in the chess game, draw to an inside straight. If you're playing tennis, try to hit a home run. Very intelligent. Jonathan seemed unruffled. Why not, he said. It all seems clear enough to me. Louis, what I want you to do is this. Get a pencil and paper and dream up the silliest set of instructions you can. Or you can think of. This is my dog, Gordita. She's going to cough. I apologize. The silliest set of instructions you can think of. Louis looked puzzled. Instructions for what? For a ceremony, a ritual, a magic show for getting the clock out of its hiding place. Make it as goofy as you can. Louis felt very excited and happy. Okay, he said. If that's what you want, here you go. He ran the sideboard and dug out a yellow number 2 pencil and 5-cent pad of a writing paper. What are you doing, sweetie? Writing paper. Then he ran into the study and slammed the doors. Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman placed nervously outside. The gigantic ticking continued. 15 minutes later, Louis slid the back of the doors to the study. He handed Jonathan a blue lined sheet of paper with writing on both sides. The first line that Jonathan read made him throw back his head and laugh loudly. He mumbled rapidly through the rest of the list, chuckling all while Mrs. Zimmerman kept trying to read it over his shoulder, but finally she lost her temper and snatched it out of his hand. She laughed even harder than Jonathan had. She snorted and crackled and giggled. Finally, she handed the paper back to Jonathan. Okay, she said, so be it. First we put the lighted candle in all the windows. Real candles, that is. Yes, said Jonathan, wrinkling up his nose. I see Louis has poor taste and to prefer the real candles. Ah, well, let's get going. There are several boxes of candles, candle ends in the sideboard. Jonathan took the first floor. Mrs. Zimmerman took the second floor, and Louis took the third floor and the stained glass windows, wherever they might be. Before long, the whole house was lit up like Christmas in April. Louis paused outside the door of the room that had Isaac Izzard's organ in it. He looked into the shoebox that had been full of candle stubs. Only one left. Should he put it in there? No, there was a better place. With a fat red candle in his hand, Louis climbed the dusty spiral staircase that led into the room. He shoved open the narrow door. The room was dark except for streaks of moonlight. Oh, you guys just get to see all of my dogs. Here. Hi, Gamora. There was no better place. Let's see. He shoved open the narrow door. The room was dark except for the streaks of moonlight on the floor. Lewis moved over to the window. He knelt down and leaned forward into the deep embouchure. The oval window gave him a bird's eye view of the Hanchant house, or would have, if he had been able to see it. Brilliant moonlight bathed the hill, but the Hanchant house lay in the mass of shadows. Only the dark point of its roof could be seen. Lewis stared, fascinated. Then suddenly he began to hear the ticking, faint but audible, that filled this room in the house at 100 High Street. He shook his head, got out his matches, and quickly lit the candle. When he got back downstairs, he found that the second instruction was being obeyed. Mrs. Zimmerman was playing chopsticks on the organ in the front parlor when she got up and went back to the dining room. The organ kept playing chopsticks since it was a player organ. She had it on infinite replay. The silly monotonous music almost drowned out the steady ticking. Almost, but not quite. Jonathan came bouncing in the back bedrooms. His face was red and he was breathing hard. Okay, he said, what's next? Mrs. Zimmerman picked up the paper and read in a voice, we are here to play the game of Bon Sour 1 franc until the ace of nitwits appears. As unlikely as it may seem, Jonathan knew what Bon Sour 1 franc was. It was Lewis's name for poker. The three of them had played a lot of poker since the first August evening, and Lewis had named the game for the inscription he thought he saw on the shiny brass 1 franc piece. When you called someone, you had to shout, Bon Sour 1 franc, very loudly. But Jonathan was puzzled about one detail. He turned to Lewis with a quizzical look on his face. And what, may I ask, is the ace of nitwits? We are going to stop right there. Page 160. We're at the bottom of page 160. So I hope you guys are enjoying the book so far. Sorry for my animal interruptions. I will see you guys tomorrow. I think we only have a couple more days left of this book, and then it's all gonna be over. So leave a comment. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me how you're feeling. Tell me what's going through your head.